Okay, good evening, folks. We are now ready to get going. Thank you all so much for coming in. Welcome to Butterfly Pavilion. I'm Polly Andrews. I'm our Vice President of Programs and Interpretation here at Butterfly Pavilion. And I want to welcome all of you right here in our audience for coming and making the trip out here tonight, and then all of you that are joining us virtually tonight as well. We're very pleased to host this really important event by the City of Boulder here at Butterfly Pavilion tonight. Butterfly Pavilion is actively involved in the conservation and education practices to support pollinators and their healthy environments. Through our beekeeping boot camp, our support is sustainable butterfly farms in the tropics, Colorado Butterfly Monitoring Program, our exhibits on pollinators. Hopefully you all saw the bumblebees, those of you that were here and also went in to see our butterflies. And our new PACE initiative, this is a pollinator awareness through conservation and education. And this is an initiative which will increase the number of pollinators right here in Colorado by adding new habitat. And we very much appreciate the immense value that pollinators have to our world, and very much appreciate that you all are here also celebrating the importance of and the value of pollinators as well. So with that, we want to get this program going. To that end, I'd like to introduce to you Brett Kencairn, who will be moderating the panel discussion tonight. Brett serves as the City of Boulder's Senior Environment and Climate Planner. His primary responsibility is the ongoing evolution of the city's climate action initiatives. See that? He is also a team member in the Interim Renewable Energy Strategy and Action Team, managing several pilot projects designed to accelerate transition to a renewable energy-driven economy. Prior to working for the city, Brett has an extensive background in community-based sustainable development and community organizing with a focus on multi-stakeholder ecosystem management collaborations. So, Brett.
Thank you, Polly. Note to self, write a shorter biography. Well, welcome. It's exciting to see this many people who decided they weren't going to be a part of the 100 million people watching a debate tonight, right? Like, what would you get out of and what would you be able to do with what you're going to watch on TV tonight? As opposed to what you might be able to get out of and what you might be able to do with what you're going to get out of tonight. Because of part of what you're going to get out of tonight, I hope, is what you get from each other. Because tonight is really intended to be about a conversation in which we share with each other what we're hearing from those around us. But those, maybe in the language of David Abrams, how many have read The Spell of the Sensuous? A lovely book. Yes, one of the things he talked about was the more than human community. So a lot of what we're talking about tonight is the more than human community with whom we share this place and this planet, and who are trying very hard to communicate with us. There's even one embodied in the back. Now, I just love this. We have one of our guest bumblebees who's just managed to actually escape from the Butterfly Pavilion, and thank you very much. Well, just don't sting anybody. It'll be all right tonight. So we have four folks that are going to be helping in this discussion tonight. One of them isn't even here because one of them is online. And one of the exciting things about tonight is that we are actually live streaming this event. And it's being shown over Facebook, over YouTube. And there will be a moderated discussion taking place online simultaneous to the one that we're having here tonight. And so, in fact, online tonight is Larissa Walker, the Pollinator Program Director for the Center for Food Safety. And she will be helping to integrate those comments. And so part of the format for tonight is we want your feedback and your questions, and we want you to have them written down, because we're trying to make space for both all the questions that are coming up here and the ones that are coming in online. So if something comes up, you want to ask a question about it, raise your hand, and Rella, who is right there, will be scurrying over to you as fast as a bee and giving you a card for you to write that down. So in addition to Larissa, who's online, and I will read their biographies for you in a minute as we introduce them, but we have Amy Lewis from the Weill Foundation, Professor Dave Goulson, who's traveled all the way from England to be with us tonight, and Dr. Sinte Peacock, who's an eminent world scientist, but also happens to live in the foothills of Boulder as well. So I think what I'd like to do first is just get them on stage. So let's do that. Welcome all of our folks here. Sinte and David and Amy. Okay, so to get us started tonight, and we tried to make this a little bit more accessible by taking the table off so that you wouldn't see just our talking heads. I'm going to hand you this for now. I wanted to just also start with a few thank yous, because sometimes as we get to the end of a program, we forget to do this. And I want to say, first of all, thank you to the Butterfly Pavilion. What a fantastic facility, right? Yes, let's give a round of applause. Yes. Such facilities do not happen by either accident or lack of hard work. So I'm sure there's a lot of people to thank for that. Also, we want to thank the Center for Food Safety, the Colorado Ocean Coalition, the People Pollinators Action Network, the Sierra Club, and the Colorado State Beekeepers Association, who, by the way, provide the lovely food. Thank you so much. How about a little hand for them? And our friends, some of them embodied in bee suits and Bee Safe Boulder. To just introduce tonight, I wanted to just say, what a fantastic today also, right? I mean, just the epic fall day. I wish some of you could have been at my house yesterday. We were harvesting apples, which is always a tricky process with our apple tree because it's a late yielding golden delicious. And I don't know if some of you have this problem, but that tree, its apples aren't quite ready until the very end. And then, of course, you're fighting, is it going to snow? So we got them off this year, fantastic. The other side of that story is that it's always somehow an early blossomer. So every spring we're out there going, no, please don't blossom yet, don't blossom. And then, the snowstorms are coming. And then when it does blossom, the thing that we always run out to check is, are there any pollinators? Are there any bees? So, these things that we cherish that are icons to our years of, the fall and so on, so many of them depend on these spear and from online are going to be coming in. So, again, we're so lucky to have Dave Goulson with us tonight. It's probably not an overstatement to say he's one of the greatest bee lovers in the world. He spent his childhood chasing butterflies and collecting bird eggs, and he studied biology at Oxford University, and then he did his PhD on butterfly ecology at Oxford Brookes. And shortly afterward, he joined the University of Southampton, where he specialized in bumblebee ecology and conservation. And in 2006, he became a professor at Stirling University and founded the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, a charity devoted to reversing bumblebee declines. In 2013, he moved to Sussex. So there's a long list of other things he's done, but I want to just really give you the chance to hear from Dave. So, Dave?
Thank you very much.
Turn on.
Thank you. Do you want me to launch into, or we?
Just go right in.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to be here. It's been a busy couple of days. I know some of you have heard me speak once or twice in the last 48 hours already, so sorry if I do repeat one or two things. So I study bumblebees. I've been studying bumblebees for 20 or so years, and the first thing I must tell you, which I guess you all know because we've already heard that the mention of pollinators rather than honeybees, I get really frustrated that a lot of people out there think there's just one species of pollinator, the honeybee, and that does everything. And of course that isn't true. There are thousands of species of pollinator. There are bumblebees and little solitary bees of various sorts. And then there are hoverflies and butterflies and moths and beetles and so on. And we shouldn't forget about those. We shouldn't just focus everything on the honeybee, which is actually kind of a domestic animal. And I hesitate to say it because I'm sure there are beekeepers here, but it's actually not even a native species in this part of the world. Anyway, not that I've got anything against honeybees, but I work on bumblebees, and they're the kind of wild bees, and I think they're personally rather more lovely than honeybees. But anyway, but they're all important, as I'm sure you know. But just to throw you some figures, it's about $215 billion a year's worth of food depends upon pollinators of one sort or another visiting crops and pollinating those flowers. It's about a third of all the food that humans on the planet eat. About 70% of the crop species that we grow in the world require pollination. If we didn't have bees, basically we'd be eating we'd have rice, we'd have wheat, so we could make bread, and we could make porridge, wind-pollinated crops. Basically, we'd have sweet corn, but we wouldn't have a fat lot else. Our diets would be awful. So we need our pollinators, and of course, the kind of part of the reason for me being here is concern over the fact that they're in trouble. The problems with honeybee colonies dying have received a lot of the attention, but much less well known is the fact that our wild pollinators, those of them for which we have any kind of data, are disappearing. Some have gone extinct. In Britain, we had 27 species of bumblebee. 3 have gone from Britain. Those aren't globally extinct. They can still be found elsewhere in Europe. But in the United States, you recently lost Franklin's bumblebee. Used to live in Northern California and Oregon. It was the only place it was found in the world. It's gone. It's extinct. Hasn't been since 2006. It's almost certainly gone forever now. So we're losing these things that are vitally important to our own well-being, as well as having as much right to live on the planet as we do, whether they're doing something valuable to us or not. So we should be really worried about this. It isn't just actually about bees or even just about pollinators. Our wildlife is declining. So we don't have data for many insect groups, but for butterflies we do, and particularly in the UK we have armies of people that monitor butterfly population. The farmland butterflies in particular are declining very fast in the UK. They're down 70% in terms of numbers over the last 30 years, which is pretty dramatic, and if they carry on at that rate, there aren't going to be left pretty soon. Birds are disappearing. So there was a very recent study came out that estimated that in North America you have 1.5 billion fewer birds than you had in 1970. World Wildlife Fund tried to estimate how many individual vertebrate animals there were in the world and how it had changed over time. So vertebrates are mammals like us, and birds, fish, reptiles and amphibians. And their best estimate was that the number of vertebrates in the world, number of individual animals that we share the world with, halved between 1970 and 2010 in just 40 years. That's less than my lifetime. I was 5 years old at the beginning of that period. So if you jump on to 2050, there's a danger there'll be precious little left on this planet. And I find that really devastating, and think we just desperately need to change this. We live on this funny little round rock floating in space. It's a kind of miracle that it's here at all, and we were lucky enough to be born sharing it with perhaps 10 million species of other animal and plant. And as I said a minute ago, they surely have as much right to be here as we do, and yet we are just laying waste to the planet. We are losing all of these species. Extinction rates are running currently, best guess is between 1,000 and 10,000 times faster than the average historic rate. So we're losing, we don't really know, but somewhere between 3 and 30 species a day are disappearing. So we need to do something about it. And I guess we'll talk about that in a little while, what we might do. Why are they disappearing? I mean, the big driver is, there are lots of reasons: urbanization, motorway, tarmacs, house building, and so on. But by far the biggest reason on land is that we've gone down a route of farming which is basically incompatible with supporting any other kind of life. You go into a big arable field, whatever crop it doesn't matter, it's been drenched in pesticides. You can't find any other plant or life. There's no weeds, there are no insects, there is nothing. And we're covering an ever-increasing area of the surface of the planet in those huge monocultures. And if we carry on doing that, then wildlife will pay the ultimate price, and we will lose it. And I think we have to find alternatives to that. I'll just say a tiny bit more about, I know there's been a lot of interest in pesticides in particular and what role they may be having in driving wildlife declines. And particularly neonicotinoid insecticides, which I'm sure most of you have heard of somewhere along the line. You can't really have missed them in recent years if you're at all interested in bees or wildlife. This is something my own research group focuses on, and if you really want to see, there's a whole hour of me on YouTube blathering on about neonicotinoids. If you Google my name and Plymouth University, you will find it very easily. So I'll keep it, this will be a very short version. But essentially, they're the newest generation of insecticides that farmers use. They're really popular, but they're incredibly poisonous to any kind of insect life. 1 teaspoon of these chemicals is enough to kill 1.25 billion honeybees, and we're putting hundreds of tons onto the landscape every year. They get into crop flowers, the pollen and nectar of flowering crops, but also into wildflower pollen and nectar if it's growing in farmland with soils that are contaminated. They're in the soils, they're leaching into the waters. They're more or less in everything, and these are incredibly potent neurotoxins. Now, they aren't the only problem that we face at all, but they are, I think, clearly a part of it, and something that we need to think very carefully about whether we should try and rein in their use. You may be aware that in Europe we've introduced a moratorium which prevents their use on flowering crops, which is a step in the right direction, but you guys sadly as yet haven't really done anything to curtail their use. Anyway, on that point I shall stop. Thank you.
I think one of the things you'll notice about this panel is deeply felt personal experience actually inspired each person to take up a life of concerted research and effort. Dr. Sinte Peacock is like that as well. She's a climate, ocean, environment scientist who became interested in the impact of humans on Earth's climate after witnessing firsthand climate changes from rapidly thinning ice in the Arctic to the warming oceans around Antarctica. Her research integrates ecological, hydrological, and atmospheric sciences to study the response of the planet to climate change and to better understand the actions and feedbacks that might amplify or mitigate those changes. I just would note that she carried out some of the research on supercomputers of world oceans while she was in Los Alamos Laboratory, and also has been a professor at the University of Chicago and worked for the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder.
Thank you.
So yeah, I'm an oceanographer, a climate scientist, and I was asked not to talk about climate change so much today, even though I could talk to you for a long time about that, but rather to focus on how the kind of effects we're seeing on land, how our everyday actions are propagating into the waterways and the ocean and affecting ocean life, corals, fish, everything we love. Before I start, I just wanted to say a little more about the neonicotinoids, the neonics. One of the things that kind of fascinates me about them is they're what is called a systemic insecticide. And so what that means is you can spray them on the seeds or on the soil, and they will actually get up into every single nook and cranny of the plant and the leaves and the stem and the pollen. So as soon as a bee or anything comes along, they have no chance, because they cannot feed on the pollen without also getting a dose of those neonics. And that's different from a lot of insecticides, which can be sprayed on and can wash off. So glyphosate, which is in Roundup, which most of you have probably know a lot about, is also one of those systemic insecticides. And it's impossible to avoid those. You can't wash those off your fruit and vegetables. And one of the things that most people don't realize is that these insecticides, neonics, Roundup, atrazine, and there are a host of others. There are tens and hundreds of insecticides being used, 2,4-D, many, many. They are making their way from our fields into the soil, and most of them are making their way from there into the waterways, the streams and the lakes and the rivers, and eventually from there into the ocean. And in the ocean, they're also a big, big problem, but one that's largely invisible, one that we really know very little about, and that's very, very hard to measure, and very little research has actually been done on. Now, if you're wondering how things get from, Iowa into the ocean, a really great example of how that works is dead zones. So dead zones are these zones. The very famous one is in the Gulf of Mexico, but they're actually everywhere, dotted around the world. If you lumped all the dead zones together, they'd form an area about the size of the United States. So there are a lot of dead zones out there. And how it works is you fertilize the crops, and then all that nutrient runoff eventually makes its way down into the ocean. And then this very, very high nutrient load causes these blooms of algae. And some of these algae are highly, highly toxic. And not only that, but when the algae die, they decompose and they suck all the oxygen out of the water, and so it becomes a low or no oxygen zone. So all the fish die because they can't breathe. They need oxygen. So that's just a kind of visual example, because you can see these things of how stuff gets to the oceans. But the thing you can't see is how the pesticides are getting to the oceans. And there's been some really interesting work recently studying how there are many, many interesting things about these insecticides. One of them is that the time at which they impact a human or a fish or a coral is critically important. So, for example, if some little coral larvae is affected, is subjected to a certain dose of a certain insecticide, it might have a completely different effect to the adult or the juvenile of that species. So there are these windows where it's really critical that you don't expose these animals. And what has been found is a lot of them are what are called endocrine disruptors. Not just the pesticides, but phthalates and PCBs and BPA and all kinds of things that we're using in our cosmetics and in our laundry detergents in our everyday life. They're all, a lot of them are these things called endocrine disruptors, which means that at very, very low levels, they can mimic hormones like estrogen, thyroid, in your body and in other creatures' bodies, in all of our bodies, in all of the animals' bodies. And they can really cause a lot of developmental problems. One of the things, there's a very, very famous study with atrazine where it's been shown that amphibians, frogs, will turn from male to female when they're exposed to atrazine because it's such a strong hormone mimic. One of the other things with exposure to these pesticides is that often what happens is that the adults look fine. For example, with corals, really interesting work done. This is jumping a little bit, but sunscreens contain a chemical called oxybenzone. Most sunscreens, not all sunscreens. And when swimmers slather themselves in sunscreen, this chemical washes off. And so if you go out and measure water samples right after people have been swimming, it's fairly high in this chemical. And what has been found is that the corals look fine in these areas, but they're actually sterile, so they can't reproduce. Either that or their babies are sterile, so that they're kind of have become this evolutionary dead end. They look fine, but they're actually, in an evolutionary sense, dead because they can't have young. And these chemicals are, again, endocrine disruptors. So they're doing all kinds of things that we're only just beginning to understand and learn about. They can affect fishes in many, many ways, corals, algae, all kinds of organisms that live on and around the reef. And then what happens is they will build up as they go up the food chain. It's called bioaccumulation. So the little creatures have very, very low concentrations. They're eaten by the fish. They have slightly higher concentrations, and the big fish have higher concentrations, and so on and so on. And then by the time you get to the giant fish and the giant mammals in the sea, you can have very, very high concentrations. The classic example you may all be familiar with is mercury. So tuna and the other large fish have very, very high loads of mercury and PCBs. So you probably don't want to eat them if you are pregnant, or if you don't want to give them to your young children who are developing. But that's the same for all these, a lot of these chemicals, which some of them will degrade fairly quickly. Other ones are more persistent in the environment. The ocean, for me, I've been studying it for a long time. There are a lot. I feel like if we went back to 1950 and a group of aliens came in and said, how can we destroy the ocean in the next 100 years? And they'd come up with all these ways. I don't think they could have done as well as we humans have, because, we're overfishing, we're trawling, we're putting in huge amounts of pollutants. There's climate change, which is leading to ocean acidification, which is going to be a huge problem down the road. We're warming the ocean, which can bleach the corals. We're doing all kinds of things to the ocean, and we're pulling most of the fish out to eat at the same time. So it's very, very hard when you have these multiple things hitting a organism. And I think the same with honeybees. When you don't just have the neonics, you have all these other things hitting them too. So it's very, very hard. You can say, I'll give you for a second. One more thing I wanted to say is this question that nobody really addresses, which is synergy. So you have, when you do a study on the effect of a pesticide on a mouse or on some kind of animal, always what is done is you'll take one thing. You'll take glyphosate, or you'll take atrazine, or you'll take one single thing, but nobody explores the impact of these things in combination. And you never really find a single pesticide in a water sample. You always find many, many pesticides. And when people have started looking, they're finding that if you put multiple toxins or pesticides together, the effect can be much, much greater than the sum of the parts. So that's another really interesting thing that I think we're going to hear a lot more about in the future years.
Okay, so before I introduce Amy, I just want to make an observation, which is I should have warned you ahead of time. There's some difficult information in tonight's conversation, but there's also some really hopeful information in tonight's conversation. So don't shut down. You know, we live in a world where we get so much difficult information that at certain points you might just notice, I'm like, what was on the debate again tonight? I was like, I really wanted to go. It's coming around. But part of this is that we need to be aware of what the circumstances are so that we know how to respond to them. So, and in fact, next, I think you're going to start to see this a little bit of a pivot to talking about what can be done. Amy Lewis joined the Wild Foundation in 2015 to build a network of impassioned stakeholders in the wilderness movement to help others empower wilderness and the world. Since the age of 9, when she became concerned for endangered bats and spurned a plan to carry out a fundraising campaign on their behalf at 9, Amy has been an ardent wilderness advocate. And she's done a huge amount. She's actually in the midst of getting her doctorate on pollinators and policy. And I think that she'll start to make this connection for us about what can we do about that. Amy?
Hi. Thank you. Hi. So a little bit different. I'm a little bit different than the other panelists up here. One, I haven't actually finished my dissertation yet, but I keep promising my committee that'll happen before the end of the decade. But second, I'm not a natural scientist. I'm a social scientist, so I study people. And of course, the environment is as much sociological as it is ecological. One has only to consider the role of the dominant power or dominant influence on the landscape to realize this. If a group of indigenous people are kind of the dominant influence on a piece of land, that's probably going to look very, very different than if a multinational logging concern is on that land. And so ecology, ecosystems are just as much about people and our institutions as they are about the natural processes. If you'd indulge me for just a second, I want to talk a little bit about my work at the Wild Foundation and touch a little bit on something that Dave mentioned earlier. We're going to hear a lot of science. We're going to hear hopefully some wonky policy stuff from me. But I also want to talk about something that others consider maybe a little soft, maybe a little fuzzy, but which the Wild Foundation and I consider to be very important. The fact is that Dave's right. We live on an incredibly precious planet. You can go probably anywhere else to any other rocky sphere in this solar system and find gold and platinum and things like that. But only on Earth are you going to find a honeybee or a bumblebee, a rusty patch bumblebee, or an elephant, or these gorgeous, rich, vibrant oceans. That makes our biodiversity precious. It's precious because, one, it supports our physical needs and our material needs. Without this foundation, our society cannot prosper. We can't have human well-being. But it also, I think, supports our emotional and psychological well-beings. The fact is that the Wild Foundation very much takes the view that in wilderness and in the non-human community, we draw near something that's lost and undiscovered in ourselves. And so by engaging with the landscape and protecting wildness, we're also protecting something special about humanity and about ourselves and this web of life we live in. So this is important it's not a luxury. It's important from a physical and material perspective, but it's also important as a part of our identity as human beings and as the dominant species on this planet. Now, my work in environmental policy is really at the nexus of democracy and pesticide policy. There is an idea out there that our political system functions as essentially a democracy. We would call it polyarchy or rule by interest groups, but basically there's an interest group for every interest out there, and those interest groups are operating on a relatively fair playing field, and competition exists, and that's healthy. What we find when we look at pollinator policy in North America is that, in fact, not all interest groups are created equal, and not all playing fields are even. And there is special access granted to many of the agrochemical interest groups and industry groups that isn't granted to environmental and public interest groups. So, for example, when an agrochemical goes for registration at the EPA, oftentimes the industry or the company that is putting that chemical forward will be able to register the chemical and conduct the safety study by itself, submit that to the EPA, and then have that study immediately classified. So it's not subject to peer review. And other groups are not allowed to learn the details of that study. As a result, environmental and public interest groups are always a little bit behind the curve because we don't know all of the information that our decision makers are using to base their decisions about agrochemical registration. And if we want to make systemic change to the pollinator issue, and if we want to regain control of our environment, the production of our food, and the non-human web of life that we live in, we're going to have to address this at a political level as well as at a scientific and technological level.
So let's start with a little conversation amongst ourselves. And this is the chance where if you've got a question, it'd be a great time to raise your hand and Rella will get you a card. And for those who are watching online, you can chat in the questions and we will capture those and bring those forward as well. So Dave, I guess I want to start with you. Let's now, we've done a pretty good job, I think, of talking about the challenges. Where are the opportunities for action? And maybe it would be worth, and I want to just note, by the way, that on the wall around us are posters that talk about ideas and actions and how we monitor progress. So in thinking about actions, I think there may be several different levels we could talk about. The individual, the community, perhaps the larger community as a nation. So where do you see the opportunities for action? And also, especially, where have you seen action that seems to be making a difference?
Yes, lot there. Where to start? So, firstly, people won't. We need lots of people to care. We need people to environmental issues to be raised on everybody's agenda. And what worries me most is we're sort of hurtling headlong towards ecological disaster, and most people are blithely oblivious to the whole thing, couldn't give two hoots, or just totally unaware. I mean, one sad thing is that those aren't the people sitting in this room, and I often find myself kind of preaching to the converted about these issues, but the bulk of people that live in Denver that didn't come to this talk are the ones that actually could perhaps have benefited from thinking about environmental issues. So how do we get to them? I don't have a simple answer. I don't think there is a simple answer, but local initiatives can really help. I really like the idea of kind of bottom-up approaches to the fantastic stuff going on in Boulder at the moment, where we've got the Be Safe campaign, getting individual gardeners to sign up to not use pesticides in their gardens, and sort of crazy people dressed as bees, and there we go, fantastic. And there was a fair on Saturday, so people walking past couldn't help but see a girl dressed as a bee on stilts and this crazy guy and a whole load of other stuff are going on. And some of those people must have stopped and must have learned a little bit that day that, you know, about bees, people who wouldn't be in this kind of audience. So more stuff like that could really help. And bees are, I mean, obviously bee declines aren't the only environmental issue by any means, but they're quite a nice, easy way to kind of introduce people to the bigger problems, because it's quite easy to grasp that we need pollinators. Without them, we'll lose our crops, we'll lose our tomatoes and strawberries and so on. And so if you can get people to understand that bit, then maybe, you know, you can then subsequently build on that. It's much harder to tackle farming, but, you know, maybe that through that kind of approach we could work towards having all of our towns and cities pesticide free. I don't really see any reason why not. There are already plenty of examples, places like Toronto, where they've got rid of pesticides in a huge city, and it's still standing. Toronto hasn't been it hasn't been eaten by Japanese beetles or anything else. The parks still look nice. It's perfectly possible to have a lovely garden or a lovely park without using any pesticides at all. So why the heck don't we all do it? So that, I mean, that would be great. It doesn't tackle the farming issue, which is a harder one, because that's something that individuals can't so easily influence. But there are ways we can. I mean, I personally think we need to fundamentally overhaul farming. The current farming practices are completely in the stranglehold of a few huge companies who are just ravaging the earth to make money. And crikey, we need to stop. We need to stop them somehow. But one thing we can do is buying choices. You know, buy locally produced food, buy organic food. Don't buy the rubbish that's produced in those huge fields. And if nobody bought it, then they'd have to stop making it that way. Obviously, that again we need to get enough people involved in making those choices, prepared to actually spend a little bit more for some healthy, pesticide-free local food rather than some rubbish been imported from the other side of the world. Those are my immediate thoughts, but I'm sure the others have got lots of ideas.
Sinte? So the question is, where can we act? And where have you seen action that's encouraging to you?
Okay, well, it's overwhelming and it's really difficult, I find, as a parent, because there's so much coming at you, and you can't use this water bottle because it's going to leach BPA, and you can't use that water bottle, and you can't use these Tupperware containers, and you can't use this stainless steel pot, and you can't use these non-stick things, and I feel like I can't do anything. And with the food I eat, it's like I try to eat all organic. It's really a difficult thing, but I think one step at a time is really, really important. And to get involved at a community level, I think is really fantastic if you can do that. I've been a board member on the Colorado Ocean Coalition for a few years, and they have some fantastic things that they are working towards, trying to engage policymakers. And it's really nice to feel engaged on that level, because you can get quite depressed if you're just sitting at home alone and getting bombarded by what's going on in the world. So I would say, start with your own home, start with your own garden. We haven't ever used pesticides in our garden. We have this amazing garden with all kinds of wildlife, from a million kinds of insects and native bees, and we have honeybees now, and squirrels and foxes and raccoons and bears and everything you could imagine in this tiny little plot. I mean, it's about 2 acres, but it's pretty much a tiny plot of land. And start there, and it's nice if you have kids to let them go out and see this and find snake skins and find frogs and just like find a little of life in your backyard and try to understand how this is all connected. We've started growing our own food in the summer, so I don't have time to grow food, but we have a couple of acres. So one of those acres we've given to a local farmer, and he grows a huge amount of food there in the summer, and in return we get more food than we could possibly eat for about 6 months of the year, local organic food, which is an amazing thing. And so I would love to see more, especially more education of children. That's something that's close to my heart, because I think, you know, obviously children are going to be the people who fix this mess that we've got ourselves into. So I would love to see kind of the children becoming more engaged and more educated in the issues, because I know that in general they care a lot and they want to know what they can do and what the issues are.
Thank you. Amy?
So I really appreciate what Cinta said, because initially when you're talking about how overwhelming it is as a consumer alone in the grocery store, faced with all these products and labels, and you have a limited amount of time, you just want to get home, you've worked 50 hours this week, it's hard to figure out what is good for you, what's good for the environment, what is greenwashing, what is actually authentic. And that is why we have to engage on multiple political levels, because we need help to be our best selves. We can't be our best selves and raise a family and hold down a full-time job, especially when it comes to the environment. We need our decision makers and our leaders at a local, regional, and national level to be supporting us in our desire to be responsible people. Thank you. See that crazy V guy? He isn't so crazy after all. So we need help. So how do we get that help? Well, the first thing is we're at a disadvantage. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to sugarcoat. Because we don't have a lot of money, because we're not a single entity, we represent a diffuse movement of individuals who care. We have a lot more work and a lot more organization to do in order to kind of create an alternative power center that supports decision makers in making the right decisions. And so that requires being active, that requires being vocal, and that requires communicating early and often to people running for office and in office that this isn't a luxury. Bees are not a luxury. Healthy food isn't a luxury. The environment isn't a luxury. This is fundamental to our prosperity, to our security, and to our safety. And if we want to be responsible people and have an enduring civilization, we've got to get this right first. The burden of responsibility to some degree is on all of us. We have to act, and we have a limited time to do so. Within the next 30 to 40 years, it's estimated that about 25% of all living creatures on planet Earth will have gone extinct. We need to act now, and we have the opportunity to do so. We live in democracies. We have the capacity to exercise our voices. We just need to start getting organized and doing so in a very rapid and very concentrated fashion.
I think it's awesome that you are expressing gratitude for all the good things said. I'll bet they would say you don't have to clap after everything that we're saying up here. And now we're starting to shift over. So, and Rel, if there's cards you want to bring forward, this would be a good time. I just want to make a couple of observations about things that I've noticed that are happening out there. So in Boulder, both the city and CU have completely eliminated the use of insecticides and fertilizers in their parks and open spaces, so that our children are not being exposed to that. And I've seen some of the most beautiful lawns I've ever seen in our community. CU's actually gone a step further, and they are using compost tea to accelerate actually their grounds, not only in terms of being weed-free, but they're also setting carbon at a much higher rate doing that as well. At a community level, we basically discontinued the use of almost all the pesticides associated with the emerald ash borer, except in very rare instances, which is a very brave step for our forester to take, because basically we're going to lose about 20% of our canopy to the emerald ash borer. But rather than try to make a futile effort to stop that, we said, how do we work with this progression? How do we actually then start to plant new things that are going to be better adapted for the environment that's coming forward? So there are things that we can do and are doing. And I also want to note that I think 2 years ago, Becky, where are you? Becky Dickinson. So I think Becky was responsible for helping, and I'm sure some of the other folks here were as well, organizing the panel 2 years ago on pollinators, right? And we didn't know what was going to happen out of that. It was just trying to get people together to think about this issue as it was emerging. And some of the people who were in that audience said, we need to do something about this. And I want to be able to do something now, and I want to be able to control what I can do. And so they started to get together and say, well, What if we could get a group of our neighbors together that would actually agree not to apply pesticides in our yards? And what if we called it Be Safe Boulder? And that sort of nascent movement got started and is now, I don't know, how many places is it now?
4 neighborhoods, 14 neighborhoods in progress, and over 2,000 neighbors have pledged.
Thank you. Thank you. And that's worth clapping about. And as I understand it, we have requests for Be Safe guidance in other communities as well?
Yes, and for that reason, we're no longer Be Safe Boulder, but now we're Be Safe Earth.
Nice. Thank you. So I also just want to call out that you can have a much bigger influence on policy than you think. And I want to just tell you a quick story about that. We have a woman in our community named Elizabeth Black. How many of you know Elizabeth Black? Yeah. You probably know Elizabeth Black because she is absolutely relentless in her advocacy for responsible agriculture and carbon sequestration. And she has single-handedly made carbon sequestration a core priority in the comprehensive plan update that we're doing right now. By just showing up at every council meeting and every advisory board meeting and quietly, patiently, and persistently communicating the values and benefits of carbon sequestration and good agriculture, that's now being written into our policies as we speak. Every one of you can do something similar in your local communities and in your states. So please don't think that there isn't something you can do. The last thing I would want to say is part of the consequence of a kind of world in which 100 million people are currently watching a sort of game show on television is that we don't get to hear about the good things that are going on. I mean, I'm looking into this audience and I see leaders in the solar field sitting in this audience who are actually pioneering new ways to create solar in our community. I see some of the leading agriculturists and researchers. I see the Be Safe people. There's so much going. I see one of the most amazing beekeepers I've ever met who's made me a passionate lover of bees. We need to be telling these stories. If there's anything that we should be doing more of, it's capturing and telling the stories. Because as you know, in this world that we live in right now, who do you trust? Who do you trust? Our trust barriers have gotten closer and closer and closer till it's only a few people are probably around you that if they said something to you, you'd say, yeah, okay, I believe you. That means that every one of you has a whole bunch of people that you're associated with that trust you. So it's the opportunity now for us to actually start to expand our spheres of trust and start to share this information so that we can start to really take action out there. Relic, questions? Okay. Well, we're going to break with tradition a little bit here. Would somebody like to raise their hand and ask a question? Far back. Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So first, our good friend in the back says, I'm very grateful for each and every one of us who are willing to go forth with eyes open and the compassionate action to benefit all beings. Could you each just take a bit deeper, each dig a bit deeper, faced with the overwhelming changes that are taking place? Most of us who have been working with eyes open for the past 30 to 50 years appreciate hearing from the younger generation about how you keep going when despairs start to set in. Thank you. Thank you. Well, as people who face seriously difficult things every day, I bet you might have some stories about how you keep going. Sinte, would you like to start?
Okay, well, the first thing I did was I tried to do, I and my family tried to do everything we can that we are aware of. So we put solar panels on our roof. We put a geothermal system in our house so that we're running off geothermal energy instead of coal. We have an electric car, grow a lot of our own food, as I said. So there are all these steps that we have tried to take to kind of live more true to our beliefs and values, because I know a lot of people, scientists especially, will talk the talk, but then if you ask them if they're doing anything, they say no. if that's someone else's job, like I just do the science. But I feel very strongly that all of us need to start doing that, living in line with our beliefs and values. And it's actually not always easy to do that, as I've found. So a couple of years ago, we moved out into Boulder County, into a district that's zoned agricultural, because we wanted to, have land and animals and space for food. And the problem was that everybody in the neighborhood, even though it's zoned agricultural, has these amazingly huge lawns that are all trimmed to within like half an inch of their life. And they spray these lawns day and night, and they flood them with insecticides because they don't like dandelions. And nothing we can say. I mean, I think, I need to come out and talk to them, but we have not been able to change any minds. So we're surrounded by, toxic pesticides and people who don't like us growing things. And so we've had complaints to the council because we have butterfly weed and milkweed and shrubs and all this permaculture setup that's very, very insect and animal friendly, but it's not neighbor friendly. And the bylaws, the way they're currently written, are that you can't have anything above 9 inches high that's not actually a food or in a bed, especially if it offends the prevailing neighborhood aesthetic, which it does. We're offensive to our prevailing neighborhood aesthetic. But it's, it's what you need to have an ecosystem and to have healthy insects and honeybees and life. So it's not always easy, and that's frustrating. And, I see this bad news every day, and it sometimes does get me down. And I think it sometimes gets us all down because it's completely overwhelming. And you feel like there's nothing you can do as a person, even though you're doing what you can do. So I think my positivity comes through my kids and trying to, raise my kids to be really good and caring people, and I think that's where mainly the hope is with me. I've kind of given up on the older generation.
I don't know how to answer this. One thing I would like to raise is that I think we need to all try not to be so wasteful generally. And it's a really simple thing to do. But the figures suggest that, to come back to sort of farming briefly, we're damaging the planet to produce food for us. But then we throw most of it in the bin, or not most of it, but a huge chunk of it goes to waste. About 40% getting on of all the food grown in the world, all those huge fields full of crops that are damaging wildlife and so on. And then when we get it, we leave it in the fridge, and then we notice it's gone past its sell-by date, and we throw it in the bin, which after all of that, it's just absolutely crazy. So if we could find ways as individually and collectively to reduce food waste, we wouldn't need to do half as much of that super intensive farming. So that's one thing. Kind of relating to that, I think we should try and get people involved in growing their own food as much as possible. And I grow my veg in the garden, and it kind of it's a really great way to connect with where food comes from, which is something slightly worries me, that generally people seem to have forgotten where food comes from, and they think it just magically appears in a cellophane wrapper in the supermarket rather than actually growing in a field, needing a bee to pollinate it and soil to grow in and all the rest of it. In the UK, there is currently 90,000 people on waiting lists to get allotments, but they just can't get them because the land is all locked up under big farmers' fields. And I think that would be that's such a shame, because it's a brilliant way to connect people back with nature, getting them producing local food, healthy food. And if you grow your own food, you wouldn't dream of sticking loads of pesticides on it, because you know you're going to eat it in a little while. And it brings home how crazy what's going on in farmers' fields, where fields are being drenched in maybe 20 different toxins before they end up in that cellophane wrapper in the supermarket. Yeah, indeed. So trying to, I think that's a really nice way to try and reconnect, and maybe we need to teach kids how to grow veg. We need to all try and encourage schemes that enable people to grow their own veg one way or another in their garden or in allotments or whatever. But to come back to the how do you keep going and remain optimistic, I personally I'm not really terribly optimistic about the future, but you have to, so it will be worse if we don't all try and do something. Maybe we can achieve a miracle, and it'll actually not be too bad at all. But even if we don't achieve a miracle, if we achieve anything, it's better than doing nothing and just giving up and saying, oh, well, sod it, I'm just going to go and watch the game show instead or whatever. So, we all have to try. We all have to do our best to make it better than it might otherwise be.
So One of the things I love, I think maybe this might be my favorite thing about Lord of the Rings, besides the walking trees, is the fact that the world only had to be saved once. I mean, like, you got this magic ring and you just throw it in a volcano and then you can wipe your hands and go home and celebrate, and that's that. But the fact is that our world has to be saved anew every single generation. Every single generation, leaders have to arise, responsible people have to arise, and we have to do our part to save it. Now, of course, we are facing some pretty unprecedented challenges right now, okay? We've never had to ask the questions that we're having. Thank you. I'll switch. We never had unprecedented challenges. We've never had to ask the type of questions that we're asking, like, how do we stabilize the climate everywhere? How do we save biodiversity everywhere? But you know what? We also have unprecedented resources. We have unprecedented leaders, whether it's the people in our own community that Brett has shouted out for doing such amazing work, or just the people that I work with. Every day, I am humbled by the incredible courage and compassion that I'm surrounded by at the Wild Foundation. You know, we have this project in the rugged deserts of West Africa that are, you know, full of bandits and Al-Qaeda terrorists and elephant poachers. And we're trying to save one of the last 2 desert elephant herds out there. And we're being helped by 600 young men in villages who are making subsistence level wages, who ride camels out into the desert every day to keep watch over the elephant herd. Just last year, their leader was assassinated by Al-Qaeda affiliate who we believe is trying to poach the elephants and trade their ivory for weapons. But we have 600 young men who, if it wasn't for them, those elephants would be gone right now. And they're doing it for basically nothing. And if they can do it on camels with very little technology, save one of the last herds of desert elephants, then by golly, I think we can do a hell of a lot here in Boulder. And so there's enormous reason to have hope. We just have to act on it, and we just have to keep being inspired and humbled by the people to our left and right.
Thank you. Yep. I want to just say that part of my hope is climate change. Because climate change, by the way, I don't think climate change is a problem. It's a symptom, it's a message, and it's a message that actually we're increasingly unable to no longer hear. And I think that basically the earth is going to tell us whether we're going to listen or not, but I think that we're going to have to listen, that there are certain things that we've been saying were sustainable and aren't. And in our climate action plan, we say there's 3 sets of things that basically have to change. We have to change our energy systems. We can no longer afford to burn fossil fuels. And we're better than that, frankly. We literally can create a society that runs on free energy. We just have to invest in the things that can now capture that. So pretty straightforward. The second thing is we can't use resources the way we've been using them. That's just ridiculous. We don't just, dig a bunch of stuff up and then throw it away again. And the third thing is, and this is where it comes back to ecosystems, the more than human community that has been working tirelessly for millions of years to keep this system in relative balance has been basically abused to the extent that it can't do its part of the job anymore. And that what we need to recognize is that they're our allies. They are our most important co-conspirators in putting this climate back together. So I think that as that starts to get more and more obvious, we're going to stop seeing this as the natural world and the sort of, forgive me, but wild world. It's the more than human world. It's the rest of the community that we're just a part of, and that we need to recognize that we're just one part of.
Well, humans are wild too, Brett.
No, absolutely. But I'm saying that distinction of some place out there that's natural and us isn't a very useful distinction anymore. Oh, so we have a couple questions from I think both online and the audience. One is, I think that several of you might have, what is the best resource for current data and statistics? In other words, how do we track how we're doing? And not just at sort of at a larger global level, but at a local level. So thoughts and comments on that? Especially, let's say, with around pollinators. Or you might also say, Dave, are there suggestions for how we might start to create ways of monitoring our local pollinators so that we know how we're doing?
Okay, so we have data monitoring schemes in place for some wildlife groups, birds and butterflies to some extent. Britain actually is really good at monitoring stuff because we have hardly any wildlife and loads of wildlife nuts, so it's relatively easy. But even there, we don't have data for most pollinators. And actually, there is a fundamental difficulty there because there are 4,000 species of bee in the United States, and most of them no one could identify without a microscope and several hours with the key. So it's really difficult to come up with a way of monitoring all of these things and seeing how their population is changing over time. But that said, there are ways it could be done. There are people trying to set up various kinds of monitoring scheme. There's a thing called Bumblebee Watch, which is a citizen science scheme in North America, where you can take pictures of bumblebees and upload them on a website and get them identified. And that helps to map the changing distributions of at least bumblebees.
Could you help us connect to that?
If you Google Bumblebee Watch, that's all you need to know. You'll find it straight away at the top of the list.
And just, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but because you might be able to weave this in, did you mention the Bumblebee Conservation Trust?
So I didn't, but I could. The Bumblebee Conservation Trust is a charity I set up 10 years ago in the UK to look after bumblebees. And among the things it does is it has bee recording schemes. It has a thing called Bee Walks, where we have about 350 people around the UK who do a walk once a month through the spring and summer, identifying and counting all the bumblebees they see. It's been running for about 7 years now. Maybe there could be a North American equivalent. It does lots of other stuff, trying to create habitat and educate people about bees and so on. I'm not sure there's actually a need for someone to try and set up an American Bumblebee Conservation Trust, because actually the Xerces Society do most of those things really, really well already. They may not be doing the monitoring bit, but in terms of advocacy and all the rest of it, they're actually a really good organisation. And if you're interested in looking after insects generally in North America, then check out the Xerces Society.
Thank you. So just a couple more, and I just want to note that when we wrap up tonight, there are these signs that we would love people to put ideas on, ideas and actions, and monitoring programs. We've just heard about a couple of them. And we'd love for you to stick around and mingle and talk about what we can do here locally. Who knows, maybe another idea like Bee Safe Neighborhoods will rise up. This is a great question. With a major means of getting positive movements forward to combat the kinds of destructions that we've been seeing being awareness. In other words, with awareness being kind of this critical ingredient, where do you see the breakdown in the increase of awareness? In other words, why aren't 100 million people watching this instead of the so-called debates taking place on television?
Thank you. Okay, so I'm so glad you asked this question. A few months ago, there was a report that came out that said that conservation documentaries aren't working because we've had this exponential increase in conservation documentaries, and everybody knows now about the plight of the pangolin and whatever else. But we also have a spike in biodiversity loss. Therefore, conservation documentaries don't work. I think that they miss the point. Awareness is necessary. It is absolutely necessary to solving the problem, but it's not sufficient. So we need to continue to build awareness even as we move forward. So how do you translate then awareness and passion into actual changes? And the first thing is that society has to realize that the problem's urgent, so they're not just aware, but that there is a narrow window of opportunity to impact it. So they're primed to act. And then there has to be an avenue or channel of opportunity to take action. And in at least the American political system, that's where things break down. Because our political system has, since the 1960s, kind of reoriented itself to be a little bit oppositional to direct action. It's okay to go to the ballot box, it's okay to go to the polls, but by the time you get there, the agenda's already been picked for you. You have a list of things you're voting for, you have a list of candidates who believe in a list of things, and if, pollinators aren't in their priority, if saving the biodiversity of the planet isn't in their top 3 priorities, you're kind of screwed as a voter. So in the United States, at least, we have to start making our own opportunities by condensing movements, by organizing, by creating very vocal community and regional centers. We are forcing leaders to pay attention to us. And at that point in time, when leaders begin to pay attention more, opportunities to influence the system open up more. There's more seats at the table and actual influence, and there's also increasing channels to be heard. But it's slow going at first. And so making those opportunities and identifying opportunities where you can kind of start taking small steps, and those small steps add up to profound momentum later on, is really kind of where we have to be in the United States right now.
I would just point it to the analogy of same-sex marriage. How many would have predicted 10 years ago, certainly 15 years ago, that we would be in the context in which it's now legal to have same-sex marriages? I mean, it was just an unbelievable idea 10 years ago. And it was the work of a lot of people who were in the vast minority who consistently, relentlessly started repositioning people's understanding and awareness about that until finally it just switched. But it was an underlying shift that required a lot of patient remessaging and a lot of making sure that we're talking to our neighbors, our families, our faith communities about what the right thing to do is there. Here's a sort of follow-on, but in a very practical sense. Somebody says, I like the grocery store analogy. In a similar vein, I have a 401k with funds that may be invested in funding things that are companies that are doing harm to pollinators like Monsanto or Bayer. Can you give any advice on how to avoid this dilemma, or maybe any of the experience in Europe about how we're starting to shift that balance of power?
Would you like to talk about European power shifts?
No. Sorry, I didn't even understand the question, I'm afraid. Could you rephrase, paraphrase?
So a lot of us who have our money saved for retirement, actually, it turns out that it's in funds that are supporting the very companies that we're saying we don't want to be doing the things that they're doing, whether it's a Monsanto or a Bayer.
But there are ethical funds available. If you want to invest in companies that are certainly less damaging to the environment, then that would be my obvious suggestion. How does that relate to balance of power shift? Sorry, this is where I got lost.
That was my addition, just to erase that from your mind. But I think in some sense, I think the Europeans have done a better job of just raising the issue as a criteria of evaluating what responsible investment is, what responsible policy is. At least that's what we hear, maybe not.
It certainly isn't apparent to me living in Europe. I mean, I was just thinking of the big companies that I find myself at loggerheads with. The Bayer and Syngenta are both European companies who are running amok around the globe. So I don't think we should hold up Europe as a great example of the way forwards.
But you did mention a ban on neonics in Europe.
Yep, that is slightly better. I mean that was political legislation to attempt to mitigate the harm the companies were doing. They weren't in any way reining in the activities of those companies. And actually the moratorium, this is a bit complicated and boring to go into, but the EU moratorium on neonicotinoids is basically a ban on their use on flowering crops like canola. But it's quite interesting that total sales of neonics in Europe went up following the introduction of the moratorium. Basically a lot of marketing from the companies that sell them. They saw the ban coming and thought, oh, we're going to lose some sales. So they went out and told all the farmers that they needed to use more of them on their other crops instead. Again, Europe is not a great example of a huge environmental success in this regard. Although, no, it's been extended indefinitely, pending new evidence that, that suggests it. Basically, I think it's here to stay, unless some very dramatic new evidence came about that overturned our understanding of these issues. But it's not terribly adequate.
So here's a harder one. Is there a way to lose an irrational idea of beauty in lawns and gardens? Now, I guess this must be, how do we get people to stop thinking that the short green lawns? Yeah.
No, I would love to hit that.
I guess I'll go ahead and take this on, even though I'm no expert on this by any means. But the Wild Foundation, one of the projects we're working on is re-inviting wild nature back into cities and help cities. Basically, the planet is going to be 70% urban by 2050. And so the front lines of conservation is really shifting to cities. And we need to be not just urban planning, but biodiversity planning. And cities need to be considering their biodiversity footprint. And so Wild Foundation has this Wild Cities program. We're inviting nature back into cities. And the way we're doing that is we're forming these coalitions around issues that are working not only on research, but also on public outreach and community advocacy to begin to shift the idea of what it means to have a beautiful city and what it means to have a healthy and functioning city. And I think with organization, with demonstration, with patience, and with time, culture begins to shift. Culture isn't a monolith. It's not something that is stagnant, static. It's dynamic. And the more energy and time we invest into it, the more influence we have over it. And so I wholeheartedly applaud and I'm sure Cinta would as well, anyone who wants to take on the notion of beauty and what a beautiful lawn looks like.
And I'd just like to note that in Boulder, in 2017, we're having a community summit on our future energy plan, like how we're going to change our whole energy system. In 2018, the plan is to have a summit on ecosystems. So I'd like to just plant the seed for any of you from Boulder that now is the time for us to start thinking about how we bring our communities together to have the conversation about how we create more be-safe neighborhoods, how we create policies that basically disincentivize the use of fertilizers and pesticides, how we start working with our open spaces and our agricultural lands in new ways. So, and for those of you in other communities, this is a very fertile time to start those conversations, and you can get these kinds of things to happen in your communities as well. Okay, and this is a great question, and maybe one that we could think about ending on, because I think it's a great invitation for us to not just turn everybody who isn't thinking like us into an enemy. It says, is anything being done to reach out to the chemistry scientists that work in the chemical industry in terms of educating them on the impact of their research?
I don't know where to start, to be honest. I encounter the people they employ, the front men that they put out there to tell the world that their chemicals don't harm anything. And I talk to them, and I don't understand how morally they can stand there and say the things they say, which they must in their heart of hearts know are lies. And they're occasionally caught out in blatant lies. I've been there when it's happened. But so, I guess they're human beings. They go home to their kids. They somehow justify their actions to themselves. But I don't understand. I don't have any idea how I can change. I'll hand it over. You obviously have an idea.
I was just going to respond. That's all. Well, okay. I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry, but no. So Of course, have the same reaction in many cases, but I've also met people who work for big agriculture, who work for agrochemical companies, and maybe I'm just naive, and maybe I just want to believe the best in see the best in everybody, but I think they're really good people. They're doing bad things, but I think that they're good people. And I think what happens is that they believe in their heart of hearts that this has to be done. They lack the imagination to see a world without this type of really deadly and really, frankly, boring industrial monolithic agriculture. And they're like, well, if we're going to feed the world and if we're going to support humanity, we have to do this. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to kind of create a renaissance of imagination and of hope, and to demonstrate that there are other ways that work just as well, if not better, and that they're even better for humanity, and they're even better for supporting the future. And so, you know, there are totally the cackling evil scientist types out there, but there's also a lot of good people who are just kind of, they have their blinders on there, and they don't see another way, and we can help them.
I'll just make that story a little personal. I grew up in Wyoming. My brother and I spent most of our childhoods hunting and fishing in the wilderness areas around Wyoming. My brother always wanted to work in the agricultural or wildlife areas. In fact, he got his fisheries biology degree, but then he couldn't get a job, and he spent his 10 years as a range tech working for almost nothing in a lab. And then he got married, and it was like, holy smokes, I need to somehow create something for my family. And so one of his professors connected him to BASF. And he went back to Durham, North Carolina, and he worked for BASF's GMO division. I can tell you for about 10 years we had strained Thanksgiving conversations in which we learned not to talk about GMOs. My brother's a really good guy, and he really cares. And he really thought that he was participating in something that was actually going to somehow help the food supply and so on. My brother just had his golden handcuffs cut the other day because, of course, as some of you probably know, BASF was bought by, I can't remember who. There's huge consolidations going on in those industries right now. And it was a liberation for him. He finally actually can now return to an alignment of his own personal values. But there are a lot of people who are bound by their current sort of dependence economically on those kinds of jobs. So I wouldn't write them off, and I would work on them, but we do have to make some bold policy moves because there are plenty of others who are just out there profiteering. So with that, I do want to give one last thank you, and this is a person who absolutely deserves your applause. And she's standing in the corner. She's probably going to flee at this point. Rella Abernathy, please raise your hand. This would not have happened had it not been for Rella, and I can tell you that Rella sits in a small windowless office on the 4th floor of a city building in Boulder and worries deeply and gravely about all this. But I've watched her actually sort of flower with unexpected insights of hope, partly because of a lot of you in this room. So please, what I hope that you'll take home from this tonight is some connections, that if you need more information, you need a place to plug in, you need to actually get some additional connection to an organization or resources that you'll find. But stay in the conversation. There's more happening than we think, and there's changes happening that are going to be really good for us all. So thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you.